The ship was dying. Siveth knew it the way she knew most things, through numbers. Hull integrity at 61%. Drive core offline for 19 hours. Oxygen reserves calculated to last approximately 12 more. 11 crew members when the breach happened, 9 now. She did not think about the 2 who were gone. Thinking about them would not change the numbers. The contemplation of distant variables drifted in the dark between systems, too far from anything useful, close enough to nothing that the star charts were mostly empty. The distress beacon had been running for 6 full rotations. The signal was strong, clean, impossible to miss. The galaxy had not missed it. The galaxy had simply calculated its response. Siveth sat at the communications console and read the 3 replies again. She read them the way she measured the cracks spreading across the secondary navigation crystal. Methodically, precisely, because measuring things was the only work left to do. The Chorus Collective had responded first. Their message was long and warm and full of concern. They offered extraction. They offered it contingent on a renegotiation of trade terms between the Collective and the Velhari High Council. The timeline they attached to this process was 40 to 60 standard cycles. Their sympathy, they assured her, was sincere. Siveth calculated that the crew had roughly 12 hours of oxygen. 40 to 60 cycles was not 12 hours. The Meridian Authority had responded second. Their message was shorter but structured with impressive care. They were willing to help. They were eager to help. However, they first needed to confirm whether this region of space fell inside their operational jurisdiction. This was not a small question. There were overlapping claims. There were treaties to consult. There were committees. Siveth did not ask how long the committee would meet. She already knew. The throne web of Kath-Sor had responded third. They sent condolences, beautifully worded condolences, the kind that suggested they had already decided what the answer was and were being gracious about it. She set that message aside without responding. The crack in the navigation crystal was 4 centimeters long now. She had measured it twice this shift. It ran diagonally across the lower left face of the crystal housing, thin as a hair at both ends, wider in the middle where some old impact had started the damage. The crystal still functioned, barely. The data still moved through it. She measured it again. 4 centimeters, no change. Ensign Yovu came to stand near the console. He was the youngest on the crew by 3 standard cycles, and he had the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to look frightened. Siveth respected the effort. She did not comment on it. "Navigator," he said. "Ensign. Have any of the responses been—" He stopped, started again. "Is there anything that looks promising?" Siveth considered the question. She considered the 3 responses. She considered the oxygen timeline. "No," she said. Yovu was quiet for a moment. The ship hummed around them. Not a healthy hum. A sick one. The kind of sound a thing makes when its parts are working harder than they were built to work. "What do humans do?" Yovu asked, "in situations like this?" Siveth looked up from the crystal. "Humans," she said carefully, "are a minor military power of moderate technological development. They are not in this sector. They are not relevant to this calculation." He looked like he wanted to ask something else. He did not ask it. He went back to his station. Siveth turned back to the console. She opened her probability model, the one she kept separate from the ship's official systems, the one she had built herself over many years of measuring things that official models were not built to measure. She updated the oxygen variable. She updated the drive status. She updated the hull reading, which had dropped another 0.5% in the last 4 hours. She looked at the number the model produced. She did not share it with the crew. There was an old feeling in her, sitting quiet below the calculations. Not exactly a thought, more like a pressure behind the sternum, where Velhari carried their secondary breathing system. She had felt this pressure before, not on this ship, not in this specific dark. But she knew it, the way you know a smell from a long time ago. Completely, immediately, without needing to name where you first learned it. The Silence campaign had felt like this. That had been 11 years back. A different ship, a different distress call, a different set of very reasonable responses from a galaxy that had calculated the cost of intervention and found it inconvenient. She had survived that. 6 of her crew had not. The Valhari High Council had lit a memorial flame. It burned for 3 cycles. She had not talked about the Silence campaign since. There was nothing useful to say about it. The data was historical. The crew was gone. The galaxy had moved on, and she had moved on with it, because standing still in grief did not change any numbers. She pulled up the list of remaining communication channels. There were still several frequencies she had not tried. Minor powers, independent operators, a few relay stations at the edge of the sector. She began working through them in order of probability, not because she expected a different answer, because eliminating possibilities was also a form of work, and work kept her hands busy, and keeping her hands busy kept the pressure in her chest from becoming something she could not control. Felt appeared at her shoulder. He was the ship's chief engineer, old enough that the skin around his eye stalks had started to go pale at the edges. He had worked 12 ships. He had seen what she had seen, and probably worse, and the fact that he was still here and still functioning meant he had found some way to keep going that she had not yet managed to measure. He looked at the crystal. He looked at her. He said nothing. That was the thing about Felt. He knew when words were useless. She worked through 4 more channels. 4 more versions of, "We are sorry, but the situation does not permit. The timeline is uncertain. Our thoughts are with you." 4 more careful, reasonable, mathematically sound explanations for why 9 people in a dying ship were not quite worth the fuel. She was nearly at the end of the contact list. At the very bottom, almost off the edge of the range map, was a human military frequency. Emergency band. Old listing. The Unrelenting, it said, heavy cruiser class. Out of range. Siveth looked at the listing for a moment. Then she went back to measuring the crack in the crystal. 4 centimeters. Still 4. She updated her probability model one more time. The model ran. It produced a number. She stared at it. The number was not good. She closed the model. She opened the contact list again. She read the bottom entry one more time. Out of range. The math was clear. A signal sent out of range was a signal sent into nothing. It was the same as shouting into a wall. She thought about the 6 crew members from the Silence campaign. She thought about the memorial flame that burned for 3 cycles. She thought about the crack in the crystal, which had been broken for a long time and was somehow still working. She sent the signal. She told herself it was for completeness, for the record, for the log that someone might find eventually, that would show she had contacted every possible channel in the correct sequence. Felt said nothing. The ship hummed its sick hum. The oxygen counter ticked down 1 more unit. Siveth updated the log, marked the frequency as contacted, and went back to work. The hours passed, the way dying hours always do. Slowly at first, then all at once. Siveth worked the remaining channels with the same discipline she applied to everything. 1 frequency at a time. 1 response at a time. She composed each outgoing message carefully, using the standard emergency protocols, including all required identification codes and distress classifications. She was thorough. She was precise. She did not let her voice shake on the audio transmissions, because her voice shaking would not help anyone. The Osari Trade Federation responded before the 8th hour was done. Their message was friendly. They were a pragmatic people who prided themselves on fast decision-making, and they had made a fast decision. They could not assist at this time because their nearest vessel was committed to a cargo run of significant financial consequence, and diverting it would trigger a breach of contract penalty that their accountants had evaluated and found unacceptable. They wished the contemplation of distant variables the best possible outcome under the circumstances. Sivith read the phrase, "best possible outcome," 3 times. She filed the response and moved to the next channel. The Velhari High Council's message arrived during the 9th hour. She had not expected to hear from them so fast. The council moved slowly on most things, preferring lengthy deliberation to hasty action, which was a quality Sivith had always respected because she shared it. But they had moved fast on this one. The message was beautifully written. It always was when the council had bad news to deliver. Some writer in the diplomatic division had spent real time on it. The sentences were balanced, the concern was evident, the language warm without being false. They explained that dispatching a rescue vessel into this region would constitute a direct violation of the 6th Accord's Article 14, which prohibited unilateral military movement through disputed transit corridors without prior multilateral approval. They had consulted their legal division. The legal division had confirmed the interpretation. They were deeply sorry. They would light a memorial flame. It would burn for 3 cycles in the Hall of the Departed. 3 cycles. Sivith set her tablet down on the console. She picked up her measurement tool. She pressed it against the navigation crystal. 4 centimeters. The crack was still 4 centimeters. It had not grown since the last time she checked, which had been 40 minutes ago. She had now checked it 7 times. Each time, it measured the same. Each time she wrote the number in her log anyway. Failt watched her do this from across the room. He did not comment. Ensign Yovu had stopped eating. He sat at his station and looked at his console screen, and did not eat the nutrition block that the automated system had dispensed for him 2 hours ago. Sivith noticed this the same way she noticed everything, as data. She noted it in her internal record. The probability of continued functional performance decreased when crew members stopped eating. She knew this. She noted it. She did not go over and tell him to eat. There was nothing she could say to Yovu right now that would make food feel like a reasonable activity. The 3rd crew member to die did so quietly, in the medical bay, during the 11th hour. The ship's medical system sent Sivith an alert. She acknowledged the alert. She updated the crew count in her log. 8. She sat with the number 8 for a moment. Then she went back to work. There were still 3 frequencies on her list that she had not tried. A deep space relay station near the outer boundary of the Kaf-Sor territory. A small independent salvage operation that ran recovery contracts in the mid-sectors. A research outpost belonging to a species called the Deven, whose territorial reach technically extended to within 2 sectors of her current position. She tried all 3. The relay station was offline. This was not unusual for relay stations in the outer boundaries. They went offline frequently and came back up when someone remembered to service them. The salvage operation responded. They were available, they said. They did recovery work. Their rates were standard. They listed the rates. Sivith looked at the rates and understood that the salvage operation intended to charge for a rescue the same way they would charge for pulling dead metal out of an asteroid field. She sent back a reply, asking if they were able to waive the fee, given the emergency nature of the situation. They were not able to waive the fee. They were a business. The Deven research outpost did not respond. Sivith sat back in her chair. The contact list was finished. Every channel had a response or a status. She had done the work completely, and in the correct order, and none of it had changed the number in her probability model. She had known, if she was honest with herself, that none of it would. She had been doing the work because work was what she had. Work was the thing that kept the pressure in her chest from taking over. She measured the crack in the crystal again. 4 centimeters. Field walked over slowly and stood beside her. He had been doing that all shift, appearing at her shoulder without announcement, standing for a while, disappearing again. She had not asked him to stop. His presence was, if she was being precise about it, the only thing in the room that did not feel like a calculation aimed at her eventual memorial flame. He looked at the crystal. "You going to send to the humans?" he asked. "I already sent to the humans," Sivith said. 8 hours ago. They are out of range." "I know," Fail said. "I didn't ask if they could hear it." Sivith looked at him. His face was the face of a person who had been on 12 ships and had seen what happens when you stop sending signals because the math says the signal won't arrive. She turned back to the console. She opened the human military frequency. The unrelenting, heavy cruiser class, last recorded position somewhere on the far side of a sector she was not currently in. The signal would travel for an unknown number of hours through empty space, and arrive at nothing, or arrive too late, or arrive at a ship that had since moved on to somewhere else. She composed the message anyway. She included all the relevant data: ship identification, crew count, hull status, oxygen timeline, coordinates. She made it precise. If someone found it eventually, they would have everything they needed to understand what had happened here. She sent it. She marked it in the log. She picked up the measurement tool and pressed it one more time against the crack in the crystal. 4 centimeters. Still holding. Still broken. And still somehow working. Field put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just for a second, the way old crew members sometimes do when there are no words left, and then he walked away. Siveth sat alone in the dim light of the communications console. The oxygen counter ticked. The ship hummed. 6 hours after she sent the signal, something answered. Siveth was running the oxygen calculations again. Not because the numbers had changed, but because running the same calculation twice sometimes revealed an error she had missed the first time. And finding an error would give her something to correct, and correcting things felt like progress. When the console made a sound she had not heard in hours. An incoming signal. She looked at the frequency. She looked at it again. It was the human band. Her first thought was that the signal was corrupted. Some kind of echo from her own transmission, bouncing off an uncharted mass somewhere in the dark, and returning to her. This happened sometimes in deep space. The physics were well documented. She ran a standard echo analysis on the incoming signal. The analysis said it was not an echo. Some old emergency response system, pre-programmed to acknowledge distress calls on certain frequencies, firing off a recorded reply that had been set up years ago by some military administrator who wanted to make sure that the paperwork looked complete. Automated responses happened. They were not rare. She checked the signal's structural markers for automation tags. There were no automation tags. Her third thought was that it was a different ship, another vessel that had picked up her transmission on a relay and passed it along to the nearest registered frequency on her list. So the response was technically coming from the unrelenting designation, but was actually from someone closer, some intermediary she had not thought to contact. She checked the signal origin point. She ran the calculation 3 times. 3 times it came back the same. The signal was coming from the unrelenting, directly. The distance the signal had traveled to reach her was consistent with the ship's last recorded position. The math of how that was possible was wrong. A signal takes time. A response takes time. For the unrelenting to have received her transmission and replied already, the ship would have needed to already be moving toward her position before she sent the distress call. Or it would have needed to be traveling faster than its class of vessel was rated to travel. Neither of those things made sense. She opened the message. 11 words. Valhari vessel, we have your position. We are coming. Hold on. No conditions. No timeline pending committee review. No mention of jurisdictional boundaries or treaty articles. No fee schedule. No expressions of sympathy in place of action. 11 words. She read them again. Field appeared at her shoulder. He read the screen over her arm and made a sound she could not classify in any of the emotional categories she had learned to recognize. It was not quite surprise. It was not quite relief. It was something older than both of those. The sound a person makes when something they stopped expecting a long time ago walks back through the door. Siveth stared at the message. Her probability model had no column for this. She composed a response. She kept it precise. Current oxygen status, hull integrity, number of crew still alive, specific coordinates updated to their current drift position. She sent it, and then sat with her hands on the edge of the console, and waited. The reply came in 4 minutes. Audio, this time. A human voice, which she had heard before in diplomatic contexts, but never like this, not tired like this, not this flat, not this completely unbothered by the fact that it was doing an impossible thing. Velhari vessel, this is Commander Voss of the Unrelenting. We have your updated position. Do you have a functioning docking port on your port side, or are we looking at a hull breach entry? Siveth found her own voice. Port docking port is functional, she said. Hull breach is confined to the starboard secondary section. Good. A pause. A sound in the background. Movement. Other voices. The low operational noise of a ship being redirected at speed. How many you got left? 8 crew members. All right. Another pause. Shorter this time. Keep 'em breathing. We'll be there. She wanted to ask how long. She did not ask because she was not sure she wanted the answer. And she was not sure the answer would help her crew. And she was not sure the answer would be a real number, because none of the numbers here were behaving the way they were supposed to. She asked anyway. Commander, what is your estimated time of arrival? Sooner than you think, Voss said. And then, like it was a small and obvious thing, like it required no further explanation, we're already moving. The channel stayed open for a moment. She could hear his crew in the background. Short clipped words, systems being activated, someone reading coordinates aloud. Then the channel closed to standby. Siveth sat very still. She opened her probability model. She put in the new variables. Incoming rescue vessel. Estimated arrival based on the speed implied by the signal response time. Oxygen remaining against that timeline. Her hands moved through the inputs automatically, while some part of her that she did not usually let run calculations was doing its own separate work underneath. The model ran. It produced a number. She stared at the number for a long time. It was not perfect. The timeline was tight. The hull would need to hold. 8 people needed to stay functional on reduced oxygen for several more hours, and Yovu had not eaten, and the crack in the crystal was still 4 centimeters long. And nothing about this was guaranteed. But the number was different from the last number. Meaningfully different. She did not share it with the crew yet. Not because it was bad. Because she was not sure she trusted it yet. Because she had looked at numbers before and thought they meant safety, and they had not meant safety. And there was a version of her that had been living inside that experience for 11 years without properly telling anyone, including herself. She picked up the measurement tool. She pressed it against the crack in the crystal. 4 centimeters. The same. And then she did not move for a moment, because she wanted to be accurate. She wanted to make sure she was reading it correctly. She pressed it again. 3.8. The crack had not grown. It had, if anything, held. The crystal was still broken. It had been broken and working for a very long time, and she had kept measuring it because she did not know what else to do with the fact of something that should have stopped functioning and had not. Field leaned against the console beside her. What did they say? He asked. They said they are coming, Siveth said. Field was quiet for a moment. No conditions? no conditions. He nodded once, slow, the way very old people nod, when something confirms a thing they believed, but were never quite willing to say out loud. The humans, he said, are a strange people. Sivith looked at the screen, where the 11 words were still sitting, waiting to be archived, waiting to be filed as data in the official log. Hold on. Yes, she said. She went to tell the crew. She told them the number from the probability model. And for the first time in 6 rotations, Ensign Yovu picked up the nutrition block from beside his console and ate it. The unrelenting dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the minimum safe distance boundary. Sivith knew this because her instruments told her, and she trusted her instruments. And her instruments were very clearly reading a ship that had decided the minimum safe distance boundary was a suggestion rather than a rule. The unrelenting came out of FTL at a distance that Sivith's navigation system flagged with a yellow warning indicator, which was the system's polite way of saying, this should not be happening. It was happening. The ship was enormous up close. That was the first thing. She had studied the unrelenting's technical classification in the database and knew its dimensions on paper. But dimensions on paper and a human-heavy cruiser filling your external camera view were 2 entirely different experiences. It moved with a directness that she did not know how to describe, except to say that it moved like it had already decided where it was going a long time ago, and the space between here and there was simply a formality to get through. Commander Voss appeared on visual comms 30 seconds after arrival. She had not known what to expect from a human face in a context like this. She had seen humans before, in diplomatic settings, in cultural exchange programs, in the occasional commercial port. Human faces were expressive in ways that Velhari faces were not, which she had always found mildly destabilizing, the way it is destabilizing to talk to something that cannot stop showing you what it is thinking. Voss was showing her tired. That was the main thing. He was showing her tired the way a wall shows you that it has been standing in the rain for a long time. Not collapsed, not asking for sympathy about it, just visibly, matter-of-factly, worn. There was something on the front of his uniform that her translator could not classify, but that her pattern recognition system identified as a liquid stain, probably from a consumed beverage. He did not look afraid. That was the second thing. She had expected some version of heroic tension in his face, the expression of someone doing a brave and dangerous thing, who knows they are doing a brave and dangerous thing. There was none of that. He looked like a person working through a shift. Okay, he said, looking at something off-screen. We're going to come alongside your port docking collar. My engineering crew is going to need your docking system to hold a manual lock, because our automated sync doesn't talk to Velhari hardware cleanly. Can your people run a manual on your end? Yes, Siveth said. Field can manage it. Good. Tell him to wait for our signal. We'll give him a 3 count on the comm before we pressurize the connection tunnel. Anybody on your end who needs medical support, get them closest to the docking port. He was already looking at another screen while he talked. Other voices moved in the background of his feed. His crew, layered and quick, nobody finishing a full sentence because everyone already knew what the next word was going to be. They had done this before. She could hear that they had done this before. The docking sequence took 40 minutes and was not clean. The automated sync failed twice, which Voss had predicted. Failt ran the manual lock from their end, using a procedure that the Contemplation of Distant Variables technical manual described as emergency use only, and which Failt executed with the calm competence of someone for whom most things were emergency use only by this point in his career. There was a pressurization error on the connection tunnel that caused a 12-minute delay. During the 12-minute delay, Voss's crew on their side of the tunnel made the kind of jokes that people make when they are working in a high-pressure situation and need their hands to stay steady, and the jokes were not entirely appropriate, and nobody cared. The tunnel locked. The door opened. The humans came through first, 4 of them in the initial group, moving efficiently, carrying equipment. They were various shapes and sizes in the way that humans were, which was something Sivith always noticed, because Valhari varied much less. One of them was very tall. One of them was very not tall. They worked together without apparent friction about the difference. Sivith directed them to the crew members who needed the most support. There was no discussion about compensation. No one asked about the relevant treaty articles. A young human crew member, barely older than Yovu, with a round face that the reduced lighting on the contemplation of distant variables made look very young, immediately went to Yovu's side and started assessing him with a small medical scanner, talking to him in the direct and slightly too loud way that people use when they want someone to keep paying attention. Yovu looked startled, and then looked less startled, and then started answering the questions. Sivith moved through the docking corridor toward the tunnel. The remaining crew were moving in groups now, guided by the humans, a steady progression toward the unrelenting. She checked each one as they passed. 7 still moving. She was the last Valhari crew member through the tunnel. The tunnel was narrow, designed for single-file movement, with handholds on both walls for stability. She was moving through it efficiently, keeping her pace steady. When the ship shifted, a minor adjustment of the unrelenting's positioning thrusters, nothing significant, the kind of micro-correction that large ships make constantly, and the tunnel swayed. She missed a handhold. She went sideways. Something caught her. Hands. 2 hands, one on each arm, firm and immediate, steadying her before she had fully registered that she was falling. She looked up. The young human crew member who had been helping Yovu. He had come back through the tunnel, apparently, checking for any remaining crew. He had caught her with the automatic competence of someone whose training had made this reflex faster than thought. He said something. She did not immediately process the words, because something had happened to her processing in the moment of being caught. She was thrown back, not in a way she could explain or document. Not in a way that had coordinates or a timeline. Just thrown back, hard and sudden, into a frequency she carried in her body from a long time ago. 5 years back. The Silence Campaign. The particular texture of that experience, which was not about the people who died, but about the hands that were not there. The specific, physical absence of someone who should have been there to catch her, and was not, because the galaxy had run the calculation and found the cost too high. These hands were here. The young human was still talking. She processed the words this time. Easy. I've got you. Take a second. She found her footing. She did not explain what had just happened. There was no explanation that would fit in the time available. She nodded at him. She had learned that humans found nodding a useful acknowledgement, and moved forward through the tunnel. She did not look back. The unrelenting's interior was louder than the contemplation of distant variables had been in its final hours. More voices, more ambient operational sound, the hum of a ship running at full capacity, rather than a ship conserving every resource to survive. Her crew were already being distributed to the medical bay and rest areas, guided by humans who seemed to know exactly where everything was, because they lived here, and this was just another day on their ship. Voss was standing at the end of the docking corridor when she came through. He looked at her, in the brief assessing way he seemed to look at everything, checking that she was functional, and then looked past her at the closed tunnel door. "All 8, he said. "All 8, she said, 2 words to a crew member nearby. "Let's go." That was the ceremony. 2 words. The crew member relayed the order, and the ship began its turn. And somewhere behind them, the contemplation of distant variables continued its drift into the dark. Empty now, the cracked navigation crystals still sitting on its console, with no one left to measure it. Sivith found a section of wall in the medical bay corridor, and sat down with her back against it. The wall was warm. The unrelenting ran warm throughout. She would learn later it was a deliberate design choice. that humans found cold environments cognitively depressing, that some engineer somewhere had decided the crew's mood was worth the energy expenditure. She only knew that the wall was warm, and that her back was against it, and that all 8 of her crew were alive. She put both palms flat against the floor. The ship hummed under her hands. She sat there for a long time, and she did not run any calculations, and she did not measure anything, and she did not think about what the number in her probability model would have been if the unrelenting had not come. She just sat there. 2 standard cycles later, Siveth sat at a desk in a Valhari transit station and wrote the official report. The desk was assigned to her temporarily by the station administration, a small room with a window that looked out onto a docking yard full of ordinary ships doing ordinary things. She had been given a new tablet. The old one had stayed on the contemplation of distant variables. Everything had stayed on the contemplation of distant variables. She had walked off that ship with the clothes she was wearing and the probability model saved in her personal archive and nothing else. The official report was not difficult to write. She had been writing official reports for most of her professional life, and she was good at them. She described the hull breach and its cause. She described the drive failure. She listed the crew members who had been lost before rescue and noted the circumstances of each. She described the distress transmissions sent, the responses received, the content and timeline of each. She was thorough. She was precise. The sentences were clean. She wrote the section on the rescue. She described the unrelenting's arrival, the docking sequence, the transfer of all surviving crew. She noted Commander Voss by name and rank. She noted the arrival time and the fact that it was, by any reasonable calculation of the ship's registered position, earlier than the signal response timing should have allowed. She flagged this as a data anomaly for the Technical Review Division to examine. She finished the official section. She sat for a moment, looking at the completed document. Then she opened a new section. She labeled it, Supplementary Notes, Classified, Personal Observation Record. This section was not required by protocol. She included it anyway. She stared at the blank page for a while. She began to type. On the 3rd day aboard the Unrelenting, waiting for the transit station connection, she had requested a communication window with Commander Voss. He had agreed without asking what it was about. He appeared on the screen, looking the same as he had during the rescue. Tired, in the same kind of uniform, with what appeared to be a different but structurally similar beverage stain on the front of it. She had begun to suspect the stain was a permanent feature rather than an incident. She told him she was writing her official report. He nodded. She asked him the question she had been composing since the tunnel. She had spent time on the phrasing, trying to make it precise, trying to make it a question whose answer would fit neatly into one of the existing categories in her understanding of how decisions were made. Commander, what was the calculation that led you to respond? He looked at her for a moment. What calculation? The one that determined the rescue was worth the resource expenditure and risk. Every other party we contacted performed a calculation of some kind. I would like to understand the variables in yours. Voss leaned back slightly. He looked like someone who was genuinely thinking about the question, rather than someone reaching for a prepared answer. Didn't run a calculation, he said. She waited. Somebody needed help, he said. That was the whole thing. She looked at him. That was the complete reasoning? Pretty much. She sat with that for a moment. The risk to your crew, the distance, the all real, he said, still didn't change what somebody needed. She tried a different angle. If you had known the full cost before departing, the fuel, the timeline disruption, the risk of the FTL approach, would you have made the same decision? He did not hesitate. Already planning on doing it again, he said. Got the frequency now. She did not know what to say to that. She was not sure there was a response that fit inside her existing vocabulary for situations like this. She thanked him. He said it was nothing, in the specific way that humans sometimes say, "It is nothing," when they mean, "Please do not make this into something larger than it needs to be." She closed the communication window. She sat, with her hands in her lap, for a long time. In the classified supplement, she wrote for 2 hours. She wrote about the conditional responses. She wrote about the Velhari High Council and the Sixth Accord and the memorial flame that would have burned for 3 cycles. She wrote about what it meant to transmit a signal out of range and do it anyway. She wrote about Field's hand on her shoulder, and Yovu eating the nutrition block, and the young human in the tunnel who caught her before she finished falling. She did not write about being thrown back 5 years. That part stayed where it was, in her chest, behind her sternum, where Velhari carry their secondary breathing system. Not a wound exactly, not gone exactly, something that was both of those things at the same time, which was a category her models did not have a column for, which was becoming a recurring problem when she thought about the humans. She wrote about Voss. She wrote about the 11 words. She wrote about watching his crew work. The short overlapping sentences, the dark jokes during the pressurization delay, the movement of people who had been afraid together so many times that fear had become a kind of coordination between them, something they used rather than something that used them. She wrote about the wall being warm. She ended the classified supplement with 3 sentences, written plainly, in the simplest language she could find. Recommend revision of Velhari probability modeling frameworks. Current models do not account for a civilization that has apparently decided the calculation is not the point. I am going to keep thinking about it. She sat back. She read it over. She submitted the full report to the archival system and watched the confirmation come back. Then she opened a new file on her tablet. She stared at the blank title field for a moment. She typed, "Humans, ongoing." She sat looking at it. All her professional life, she had kept files like this, research files, data collections, ongoing observations of species and systems and phenomena that she had not finished understanding yet. She had a file on deep space radiation variance that was 6 years old and still open. She had a file on Kot-Sor negotiation patterns that she had been adding to for a decade. She kept them because she believed that the things you could not yet explain deserved to be tracked, that understanding was not an event, but a long accumulation of measurements that eventually added up to something. She began to type. She wrote down everything she had observed. The arrival time that was mathematically too fast, the 11-word message with no conditions, the docking crew and their easy competence and their bad jokes, Voss's uniform and his tired face, and the way he gave the order to leave in exactly 2 words and moved on. The young crew member in the tunnel, the warm walls of the ship. She wrote it all down in careful sequence. She did not draw conclusions. The file was not for conclusions. The file was for data, and she did not yet have enough data to conclude anything. And she understood that she might never have enough data to conclude anything, because what she was trying to measure might not be the kind of thing that had a final number at the end of it. But she kept writing. Outside the window, the docking yard hummed with ordinary traffic. Ships arriving and departing, crews moving from one place to another. The whole ordinary machinery of a galaxy going about its business, calculating its costs, managing its interests, moving cautiously through the careful mathematics of survival. Siveth typed. The file grew. She had the feeling, she would not call it certainty, she was not built for certainty without sufficient data, that she was going to need a lot more pages. She was, for the first time in a very long time, not bothered by that at all.